A decade can be a long time in technology. 10 years is the difference between a Sega Master System and a Sony PlayStation. It's the difference between a Nokia 3310 and an iPhone 4. When I started this channel, a 10-year-old graphics card was one from 2010, and by that time the old Terascales and Fermis had aged like a fine baby bell. Sometimes, however, technology doesn't age like it should. Moore's law starts to break down. A decision by some unknown hero in one decade proves to have a positive impact in the next. The current market gets so depressing that it makes us nostalgic for simpler, better, cheaper times. Nvidia's Pascal generation is remembered fondly by PC gamers of a certain age. It represents the best of the industry at the time and also marks the end of a golden age for Nvidia, when their quest for innovation would eventually lead them to forget where they came from. The GTX 1060 was nothing special. The mid-range card Nvidia always releases to balance performance with affordability, destined for the top of the Steam survey charts, but not for the top of the benchmarks. However, being the average gamer's choice in the generation that was arguably the peak of PC gaming hardware, kinda means it's actually very special indeed. Thanks to Ubisoft for providing me with a key to Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced, the brand new remaster of the 2013 classic, which will be featured later on in the GTX 1060 benchmarks. There's timestamps if you like, but come on, you want to hear me chatting shit first, right? Don't you? What was so special about the GTX 1060? Was it somehow built different? The Pascal architecture in the 1060 and the rest of the 10 series was remarkable for its efficiency. The 16nm TSMC process node helped to produce very good performance per watt for the time. Models like the 1050 and 1050 Ti could get by without external power, and the 1060 only required a 6-pin PCIe connector, whereas the current RTX 50 generation all require 8-pin PCIe at a minimum, or controversial newfangled gizmos with a worrying habit of melting at worst. This efficiency wasn't just for eco-friendliness or cost savings either. A Pascal GPU could still consume a huge amount of power and produce a substantial amount of heat as a byproduct, but it turned that power into performance well above and beyond what it was rated for. GPU Boost 3.0 was an automatic overclocking feature built into Pascal, and it would effectively make manual OCs obsolete for all but actually hardcore overclockers. From an API perspective, Geforce GPUs had been lagging somewhat behind AMD's Radeon cards for a couple of generations, with the 600 and 700 series missing some vital DX12 instructions and lacking in asynchronous compute performance. The 900 series made up for the former, with API support extending to DX12.1, but was arguably still not beating AMD in titles which relied on DX12 or Vulkan. At the time, that wasn't many games, and GeForce continued coasting on its DX11 superiority, but the lack of decent low-level API performance would go on to become a bigger problem later on. The 10 series saw Nvidia finally getting everything right. DX12.1 features respectable amounts of VRAM for more demanding games, and class-leading performance, especially at the high end. In fact, when Nvidia discontinued active driver development for Pascal in 2025, it felt more like controlled obsolescence rather than retirement, a product whose useful life had been cut short to promote new models rather than coming to a natural end. If Nvidia hadn't stopped it, the 10 series would still be going strong today. Okay, so technology gets better over time. Nothing new about that. Surely it can't be the only reason why the 1060 is so fondly remembered. Every newer 60 class card, from the GTX 1660 to the RTX 5060, outperforms the model they replace, and all of them are still receiving game-ready driver updates. But most of them don't get gamers all misty-eyed. The reason we have positive feelings about the 1060 is primarily because of what followed. Historically, every model in a series, except for the absolute top of the stack, followed a formula. A new GPU would offer better performance than the next card up of the previous generation, using less power and for a lower price. The 1060 was a 970 beater, offering more efficiency and more VRAM for less money. Moreover, it beat the original Titan, a $1,000 250-watt behemoth from just 3 years earlier. Imagine if the RTX 5060 could outperform a 3090. Fuck off, Jensen, FrameGen doesn't count. I can see how this would have pissed someone off who dropped $1,000 on the original Titan, and considering how they got shafted by the 780 Ti and Titan Black shortly afterwards, I do have some sympathy for them, but they were far outnumbered by the people who saw the 1060 as being incredible value. Of course, we're talking about Nvidia, so it's not all good vibes from the GTX 1060. A second GPU was forged in secret, a nasty, tricksy model with a smaller 3GB VRAM pool and a reduction in cores, TMUs and ROPs, meaning less performance and less future-proofing. Part of the 1060's positive reception came from Nvidia's decision to go with a 6GB frame buffer, as opposed to the 2, 4, and 3.5GB of most previous offerings. VRAM requirements have increased dramatically in modern gaming, and that's left a lot of older cards falling short of the mark, however theoretically good the GPU is. The 3GB GTX 1060 undercut a lot of the goodwill earned by the 6GB. In decades past, the cut-down version would have earned a suffix like LE or SE, or the better version would have been called the TI, but it seems like Nvidia was happy to mislead some of their more frugal, less savvy customers into buying the GPUs that didn't quite make the cut for the real thing. I already owned a GTX 1060 that I bought for a previous video, but I only had the 6GB version. To mark this 10th anniversary, and perhaps throw some cold water on all this nostalgia, I also picked myself up a 3GB model on eBay for £45. Less than I paid for the 6GB model in 2024, admittedly, but still, more than I think it's worth. I've tested them both in games from across the last decade, using a modern test platform for convenience. Was the GTX 1060 really as good as we remember? Did it hold up as well as we think it did? And did the 3GB model undermine all that? In 2016, there was one new FPS on everybody's mind. Battlefield 1. Why, what did you think I meant? This somber reflection on the senselessness of the First World War, in the form of a blockbuster spectacular first-person shooter, proves no trouble for either the 6GB or 3GB versions of the GTX 1060. This is the kind of scenario you'd have seen in 1060 reviews at the time, whereby the 10% reduction in CUDA cores means a roughly 10% drop in performance. But the maths wouldn't remain quite so simple. While there's no sign of the 3GB card struggling at even ultra settings, it isn't going to be so lucky with the rest of the games tested. In my series of videos on Nvidia's Titan series, I pissed a few people off by invoking the name Titanfall without including the game of that name in my benchmarks. To right that wrong, I spent a couple of quid in a Steam sale to invest in Titanfall 2, which I still never actually got round to playing, so this is a first for me. Turns out it's actually a pretty good game that I'm sad to say I'll probably never get around to finishing. But it does leave me wondering why the guns are so much better in this than in Apex Legends. Both 1060s are very capable in this game, but there's more load on the VRAM than in Battlefield, and while I was able to max out the 6GB card, I had to choose lower texture quality on the 3GB version. And even with that concession, the higher end model scores about 20% higher average FPS and has smoother frame times to boot. 2017 saw Capcom's Resident Evil series moving forwards by stepping back, away from the bolder punching melodrama of RE6 and towards the smaller, scarier horror that was being popularised by games like Outlast. It also saw the first incarnation of the RE engine, which has helped Capcom produce some stunning and visceral imagery with relatively good performance, but which has also come to be associated with the insatiable hunger for VRAM that plagues so many games in the modern era. That wouldn't become a major issue until the next game, but RE7 still has issues on the 3GB 1060. There are a few frame time drops during the benchmark run that are small to unnoticeable on the 6GB model, but which make for some pretty big stutters on the 3GB version. Also, I don't know if it's part of the aesthetic, but the whole game is horribly soft. I used the combined FXAA and TAA setting for the gameplay capture because either one alone was either blurry or blurry and jagged somehow. Anyway, again, things would improve dramatically later on in the series, but I can't help but feel like this game is already in need of a remaster. DICE went a little more ambitious with the graphical spectacle in Star Wars Battlefront 2, coming from Battlefield 1, which, despite sharing a developer, an engine, a genre, and 2 syllables, are in no way related to each other thematically. The result is that the 1060s are starting to struggle with max settings, and in the tests seen on Naboo there were slowdowns on the 6GB that turned into stutterfests on the 3GB. Both perform much more agreeably at high settings, and the limited memory isn't such a clear hindrance to the lower end card. Also, my somewhat limited testing in DX12 explains why people were so unimpressed with that API back in the day. 25% worse performance for zero benefit. 2018 was the year that saw the GTX 1060 replaced, and the big new highlight feature of the RTX series was ray tracing. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was one of the launch titles for the technology, and its limited use of RT is probably one of the reasons why nobody cared about it. Shadow itself wasn't well received either, and was the last canonical entry in the series to be released before the upcoming reboot. However, despite being, I guess, a next-gen game, it runs surprisingly well on the 6GB 1060, which could use the highest preset and still achieve... Okay, so the built-in benchmark is very generous to GPUs. A large part of the third test scene is just staring at the sky, or near to it. But 50 plus isn't out of the question, and dropping to high reaches the 60 target well enough. The 3GB model meanwhile fares much better than it did at highest, and is still within some people's definition of playable. For a brief, shining moment in the late 2010s, it looked like the world of gaming would become unified. Imagine there's no exclusives. It's easy if you try. Those days are probably behind us, and people are distressingly happy about the fact, but one of the earliest Xbox exclusive franchises to cross the divide was Forza. Horizon 4 is no longer available due to the curse of the expired licenses, but I happened to buy a copy while I still could, and I'm happy to see the 1060 could have handled it very well. At least the 6GB card could. I didn't really expect this game to be all that heavy on VRAM, but the 3GB card sees a pretty big drop at both ultra and high settings, far more than the drop in core specs alone would suggest. What's that, Iceberg? More Resident Evil? You're spoiling us. RE2 Remake marked the beginning of Capcom's program to bring their beloved PS1 and PS2 titles to modern audiences, with a more modern gameplay style and aesthetics that wouldn't age as quickly as the original versions. As mentioned before, however, these new graphics use up a lot of memory, and even the 6GB card is shown lacking here. The streaming texture system means that when something doesn't fit into memory, a lower quality asset is loaded in its place, and it seems even 6GB isn't enough to ensure top quality assets in every scene, much less 3GB. If you can overlook these, the higher end 1060 runs the game just fine, even in the graphics priority preset, though the 3GB card will need some settings to be dropped, as the game will start using system memory instead of VRAM, and that will result in significant stutters. I wasn't going to make a retrospective video that covered 2019 and not include Jedi Fallen Order, that's just not how I'm built. Fallen Order is a UE4 game, and with that comes the same stutters as are currently plaguing the UE5 era. And the magical thing about them is that there's basically no cure. In the grand scheme of things, at least in my benchmark run through this part of Zepho, the loading stutters don't amount to much, and average and percentile lows are actually pretty close to one another, regardless of the GPU. The 3GB card does experience slightly lower lows at epic settings, and the average falls just below the coveted 60 FPS mark, but drop the settings to high and both cards can run the game just fine. What the hell's Cyberpunk doing here this early? Surely it's only... Oh god. Cyberpunk still feels fresh in 2026 because, well, frankly, because us benchmarksists won't shut up about it, but also because it was at the cutting edge of graphics technology in 2020 and has seen several updates since then. It's also immensely scalable, meaning it can look like a tech demo on an RTX 5090 or a living nightmare on a PS4. The 1060 is definitely closer to the console end of that particular spectrum, being similar to the PS4 Pro GPU in terms of performance, and while the game can be surprisingly lean on VRAM requirements, 3GB is pushing it. The medium preset used to be my personal standard for this game. If you can't get a playable experience here, then you aren't getting the real Cyberpunk experience, and while the 6GB 1060 is good for it, the 3GB card is not pleasant to behold. That being said, in the near 6 years since it was released, the settings presets have been tinkered with behind the scenes. The low preset looks a lot better than low used to look, and FSR3 upscaling is better than you might expect, given the lackluster implementation of previous versions. What I'm saying is, if you're willing to accept these reduced settings, you can have a pretty good time in Night City on a 3GB 1060, but you'd have a better time on a 6GB one. So, I know earlier you were expecting me to talk about Doom 2016, and I kinda baited and switched you a bit there, so by way of apology, here's Doom Eternal. Say what you will about this game, the intense VRAM requirements at higher settings, the tutorial overload, the way you'll sometimes start the game and it'll have chosen some random aspect ratio and resolution combo, all of that aside, it's damned fun. I personally prefer 2016, more for what it represented for the wider gaming landscape at the time, but it's great going back to Eternal after all this time, and it was a real highlight of making this video for me. Both cards handle it just fine, which is good to know because I remember benchmarking this game with older 700 series GPUs at the time, and they did not play nicely together. Ultra settings is actually still achievable even on the 3GB card, with the provision that shadows need dropping to medium and textures to low in order to satisfy the VRAM gods. If 80 to 90 FPS isn't enough for you, and you're willing to go lower, 1080p low settings almost hits 100 FPS on the 3GB card and passes 120 on the 6GB. If anyone ever remembers Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, it's because it was a flop, a victim of its proximity to Marvel's Avengers, a spectacular failure of a game that bears very little resemblance to this one beyond the brand. I remember it because it was one of the first games from a big-name studio that stipulated at least a 4GB graphics card in the system requirements. And I bring it up now because the 3GB 1060 was only 5 years old, and there was already a game that threatened to make it obsolete. Threatened, but didn't quite follow through. The benchmark run is flattering to the 3GB card. The 30 FPS average is mostly clawed back in the final section, which has the Guardians standing on an empty platform against a sparse background. and that doesn't exactly put a lot of pressure on the GPU. In more representative sections of the test, the cheaper 1060 falls below 30 FPS and into the mid-20s. The 6GB card holds up better, but in those heavier sections it's still hanging out in the 40s and 50s, and that's a lot closer to what you're going to experience in-game. How time flies. Forza Horizon 5 is now 5 years old, and was a staple of my benchmarks for a while. I could simply have looked back at my own data from 3 years ago, but that's no fun, and besides, I've never actually tested the 3GB card in this game. If you just go by the benchmarks, both cards should be fine at high settings. Yes, the 3GB one is scoring lower, but you're probably not plugging in a Fanatec direct drive wheel and a manual gear stick. I'm sure you can handle 50 FPS just fine. However, in-game, sooner or later you'll eventually find yourself looking at this message. From past experience, if you ignore it, you'll either eventually find the odd missing texture or weirdly corrupted asset like miscoloured grass or road textures, or the game will just quit out on you. Dropping to medium therefore not only brings the 3GB card up above the 60 mark, it also helps the game, run. For such a glossy, big-budget remake of a legendary RPG, you didn't see much of FF7 Integrate on TechTube. I covered it a couple of times, enough to know that some cards had trouble with its particle effects, but the PC port of Final Fantasy VII was lacking in the kind of useful, in-depth settings that PC gamers expect, so I guess I'm not all that surprised that it never really gets talked about in this corner of the internet. In fact, I did find that the 3GB model had the same issue with particle effects that I saw back in 2022 with other lower VRAM cards, and that it also stuttered just walking around the city. Dropping both textures and shadows to low seems to resolve the issue, and in fact brings performance almost to the same level as the 6GB card. I honestly can't remember how this ended up in my library, but what the hell? Should benchmark titles always be good ones? As a game, Gotham Knights could be ignored, but as a symbol of the decline of the gaming industry, its folly could be everlasting. DC's bright spot on the visual media landscape has always been gaming, with the Arkham and Injustice series being particularly strong, but Gotham Knights undid a lot of that legacy. And Suicide Squad would set fire to it altogether, but I'm not going to get into that here. Like with FF7, there's a clear VRAM concern for the 3GB 1060 even at medium settings, and again, that vanishes at low. If you're really excited to play Gotham Knights on your GTX 1060 and don't mind dropping quality settings to get a playable experience, you won't be disappointed by the GPU. 2023 was a dark year for PC gaming. I mean, literally, in the case of Dead Space, it's a horror game after all, but even if we look past the performance issues that plagued a lot of cross-platform releases on PC, the system requirements were getting out of hand. Many of the technical issues that were reported on release have now been fixed, but there's no getting around the fact that the 1060s aren't up to this particular challenge. The 6GB card barely scrapes 30 FPS at medium, and the 3GB card is falling well short of the mark. Dropping to low, even adding some upscaling, which I prefer not to do in GPU reviews unless absolutely necessary, even at these settings, neither card can manage even 50 FPS, much less 60. I could have picked any number of other major games from 2023 that the GTX 1060 would have struggled with. The Last of Us, Alan Wake 2, Starfield. However, as I already had Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart installed, and had to download like a dozen other games for this video, I decided this one fit the bill. Seriously, on my internet it takes 4 to 8 hours to download a modern AAA game. Don't judge me. Ratchet & Clank is a game that was designed with the PS5 in mind, a system which can allocate around 12GB towards VRAM, and although this is a PC port that has manually scalable settings, and it's made by Nixies who generally know what they're doing, there's still the feeling that even 8GB of VRAM isn't enough here. The graphics might be bright and cheerful, but the outlook is as dark as Dead Space. Neither variant can achieve a constant 30 FPS at 1080p medium, and while it's possible to achieve an unstable 60 average on the 6GB model with low settings and FSR, the 3GB model is out of contention. I'm not much of a multiplayer gamer, and it takes a lot for an online-only title to entice me. Could a game inspired by a great movie from the late 90s, probably the first time I ever saw boobs on the silver screen, be enough to make me fall in love with Helldivers 2? No, I didn't care much for it. I prefer to play solo, and this game is primarily skewed towards co-op. But as an objective tester of games, I guess I can understand its appeal. Online gamers are, as a rule, more likely to sacrifice frivolous quality settings in favour of performance. So while the 30 and 45 FPS the two cards deliver at 1080p medium are far from optimal, it's not unrealistic for a Helldiver to drop down to low settings to net a 50 to 60 FPS average. Despite being just 2 years old, Horizon Forbidden West is technically a cross-gen game, available on both PS5 and PS4. This gave me hope that at least one of the 1060s would be able to handle it, perhaps with some scaled-back settings. And that hope would soon be well and truly dashed. Performance is very much in line with the other 2020s era AAA games and PS5 ports featured so far. A barely acceptable 30-ish on the 6GB card at medium, and a cinematic 20-something on the 3GB. Achieving anything close to 60 FPS requires dropping settings almost as low as they go and adding upscaling. There's perhaps some combination of settings that could make Forbidden West work out on the 6GB 1060, but I don't see it happening on the 3GB card. Now we're moving into virtually the present day with 2025's Ark Raiders, an Unreal Engine 5 game that notoriously isn't that heavy on hardware. On the 1060 that translates to a fairly acceptable 40 to 50 FPS at medium settings, no FSR or XeSS needed. If you want 60, there's plenty of room below medium if you don't mind trading off some fidelity or performance, and we still don't even have to touch upscaling. However, much like the RE Engine games, there's some asset management going on behind the scenes to make sure the 3GB card can still play it, and that means some parts of the game can look like absolute trash on the lower end card. Again, this is a multiplayer game. Plenty of sweaty players will tell you that it doesn't even matter what the graphics look like, but I'm sure some people, like me, care about these things, so I just thought I'd point it out. I could very well have included the first Kingdom Come in this video, as it was released in 2018, but 2025's version is both critically and commercially successful, and lauded by PC nerds for being quote-unquote well optimised. Sure enough, both versions of the 1060 seem to be delivering a decent experience here. It's not a fast-paced game, so I imagine people could tolerate a 30 to 40 FPS presentation at 1080p medium, and there's always FSR if you come across a section of gameplay that starts to get choppy. Meanwhile, low settings is getting closer to the 60 mark, and FSR quality will get you over the line if you really want to. Even the 3GB model is looking playable, with 1080p low matching the 6GB card at medium, and the biggest trade-off in image quality is pop-in. The Last of Us Part 2 is going into this test at an immediate disadvantage. Even if the 1060s were capable of high settings or above, that would require at least 8GB of VRAM, so we're looking at medium at best. Are they capable of medium? As it stands, no, not without FSR. The 6GB is barely scraping 30 FPS, while the 3GB card is only pinging 20, and will probably crash or dissolve into a mess of stutters before long when it inevitably runs out of room in VRAM. Very low adds almost nothing actually, though it might make sense for 3GB owners who aren't afraid of some upscaling. Still, while I call this game well optimised compared to its predecessor and other AAA games of the last few years, it's not a low spec game by any stretch, and these mid-range Pascal cards are sadly outclassed here. Arriving at last in 2026, Resident Evil Requiem takes the RE engine another step forwards and is, for my money, one of the most visually impressive games out there for character models and smaller scale environments. Of course, we've seen how the previous RE games have felt about older cards already, and neither incarnation of the 1060 is going to see Grace and Leon looking their best. That being said, although I didn't get around to trying FSR this time, it probably couldn't look any softer than RE7. Unfortunately though, even with an almost passable average frame rate, both cards suffer from a persistent spike every few frames that feels like the game's limping along, so I can't recommend this at all. So yeah, Crimson Desert is a modern game with complex visuals that can be quite stunning, and yet it includes the GTX 1060 in its minimum system requirements, which makes it sound like we should have a fine time with this setup. But if you've seen this game before, you might be aware of how bad it can look at its worst. Massive smearing shadows behind Cliff as he runs from light areas to shadow and back again, noise out the wazoo, and failed assets, especially on the 3GB card. I have to assume Pearl Abyss didn't playtest this, because Crimson Desert looks atrocious on the so-called minimum GPU. With quality FSR, you could just about get a near 30 FPS experience out of the 6GB card, but I don't think you'll enjoy it. Character models in Death Stranding 2 are stunningly realistic, even at the lowest quality settings, but the slight air of uncanniness that we still get from digital actors only gets worse at lower quality settings. The medium preset is borderline playable on the 6GB card, but for those moments when you actually need to do stuff, you might find low with quality FSR is a better experience, though the trade-off is quite a lot of pop-in. The 3GB card, meanwhile, is kinda playable, in a pinch. Three games from the same series twice in one video? I don't think I've ever done that before. Maybe there's something in it. Anyway, the latest Forza Horizon can apparently run on weaker GPUs than at least the 6GB 1060, as its system requirements mention such weak source offerings as the GTX 1650 and RX 6500 XT. However, one thing I haven't talked about so far is drivers. Most games from 2026 will give you a warning that you need to update your drivers, because while some people will tell you that these cards still get driver updates, they're security fixes at best and don't feature any new game optimizations. This doesn't always matter, but in Forza Horizon 6, it most definitely does. The 6GB card couldn't complete a single benchmark run without crashing, and while I was able to run several races and drive around Tokyo to some extent, it still eventually crashed to desktop. You can look at these figures and take them as meaning the game is playable on these old GPUs, but unless and until Nvidia updates their drivers, or a third-party solution emerges, I'm gonna have to say no. We are well below the minimum requirements for 007 First Light, which apparently needs a 1660 at bare minimum. However, I think this is actually passable on both cards. Granted, I did have to reduce settings to their lowest, and FSR quality is pretty much mandatory to get 30+, but we've seen a lot worse so far in this video. Nope, you're not imagining things. This is Assassin's Creed Black Flag in the 2026 section of the video. The long-awaited remaster, built in the latest version of Anvil and featuring a ton of complex visual effects that are completely lost on the 1060s. I ran the built-in benchmark to avoid spoiling it for myself, as in 2013 I was too busy pretending to be an adult to play games, and I've never gotten around to playing Black Flag in the years since then. And while medium settings looks pretty doubtful, I think low with quality FSR is once again gonna save at least the 6GB card. It doesn't look too bad at these settings, though I do miss the ambient occlusion. In a couple of weeks' time, I'll be revisiting another higher-end Pascal card that will hopefully have the horsepower to drive some higher settings here. But in the meantime, the 1060 is hanging on, but only just. The 1060, like the rest of the Pascal series, is still viable in 2026, but the cracks are starting to show. If you've been holding on to your old 6GB card for the last decade, just waiting for some sense of normalcy to return to the PC gaming market, you can still just about tease a playable experience out of it in new games, though they won't look anything like the trailers. Esports players and those more interested in older games should find both versions of the 1060 satisfying, and if that's your only use case, then I can see why you'd spend 50 quid or so on one. Beyond that, the lack of driver support is going to be an issue. Some games will pester you about it, while others will crash, and one day soon there'll be a game that just refuses to launch. The 1060 isn't dead yet, but the buzzards are circling. After Pascal, things would start to go downhill for the 60-class GPUs. The 1660 series was split into 3 minutely different models, none of which delivered on the formula of their predecessors. Whereas the 1060 was a 970 killer, the 1660s failed to match the 1070 in performance or specifications. The RTX brand, launched at the same time as the 1660 and 1660 Ti, was Nvidia's attempt at gentrifying graphics cards. Unlike the lowly GTXs, the RTX 2060 was an improvement over the 1070 and even the 1080 in performance, though it still stuck with the 6GB of VRAM, and the new ray tracing and DLSS upscaling features were yet to prove their worth. The 3060 confused everyone by being the rare instance of an Nvidia GPU with more VRAM than it needed at that very moment in time. The 4060 fell short of the 3070 and even the 3060 in some situations, and the 5060 looks almost like a rebadged 4060 Ti. Worse, the 40 and 50 series had both reverted to 8GB frame buffers, despite the increasing reliance on video memory for higher quality assets and frame generation. Nvidia are holding their 16GB cards to ransom, limiting them to the 60 Ti cards and commanding hefty premiums for the extra memory, and that even carries through to the second-hand market. The Nvidia of 2026 has lost its way, at least as far as gamers are concerned. They're throwing all their efforts and resources into shoring up a technological bubble, becoming the dominant force in an industry nobody wants to succeed, and breaking the world in the process. They're turning their back on gaming, despite being instrumental in a world where entertainment is all we have. Worse, they're salting the earth behind them as they leave, turning game graphics into slop and tacitly endorsing replacing real creatives with the learning machine. Is it any wonder that PC enthusiasts are wallowing in nostalgia? Well, that got dark. Thanks for watching. Kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.